Sometimes the most expensive mistake is not what you throw away, but what you never truly understand. The enormous testing hangar at Sterling Dynamics had never been quieter. 6 advanced prototype engines rested beneath bright industrial lights, each surrounded by stacks of technical reports stamped with the same disappointing conclusion. Failed. Beyond repair. Not commercially viable. For nearly 2 years, some of the brightest engineers in the country had studied every vibration, every pressure reading, every temperature curve, and every computer simulation. They had replaced sensors, recalibrated instruments, rewritten software, and repeated hundreds of performance tests. Every attempt ended with another report confirming the same verdict. The engines were considered dead. Victoria Sterling, the billionaire chief executive officer who had built her reputation by making difficult decisions without hesitation, slowly walked between the silent machines. She trusted evidence more than emotion, and the evidence appeared overwhelming. 6 engines had consumed millions of dollars, thousands of engineering hours, and countless executive meetings. Every additional day they occupied valuable floor space meant another day of wasted resources. She looked toward the leadership team gathered beside her. "Are we absolutely certain?" she asked calmly. The chief engineer nodded without hesitation. Every department reached the same conclusion. There is nothing left to test. Another executive added, "Keeping them will only cost more money." Victoria remained silent for a long moment before signing the disposal authorization. The heavy black ink crossed the page in one smooth movement. "Schedule them for industrial surplus auction," she said. "Whatever we recover is better than paying to store failure." Nobody argued. Within days, the 6 prototype engines were transported to a regional industrial salvage yard outside the city, surrounded by abandoned machinery, rusted equipment, and forgotten manufacturing tools waiting for new owners. Most buyers walked past the enormous engines without even slowing down. The paperwork alone frightened them. The engines were simply too complicated, too expensive, and officially declared worthless. Late that afternoon, an aging pickup truck rolled slowly into the yard. Behind the wheel sat Ethan Brooks, a 40-year-old single father whose blue mechanic shirt carried faded oil stains earned through years of honest work rather than neglect. He had not come searching for aerospace technology. He was looking for inexpensive industrial equipment that could be adapted for local repair projects. As he wandered through rows of discarded machinery, something unexpected caught his attention. 6 identical engines stood quietly beneath a weathered metal shelter. Ethan walked closer without saying a word. He gently placed one hand against the cool metal housing, then slowly circled each engine one at a time. He did not search for broken components. He did not reach for tools. He simply observed details that everyone else seemed to have ignored. The salvage manager noticed his interest and laughed politely. "You can save yourself some time," he said. "Those things defeated an entire corporation. Hundreds of engineers could not make one of them work." Ethan continued studying the engines before finally asking a single question. "Do you have the testing reports?" The manager looked surprised. "You actually want to read those?" Ethan nodded. 20 minutes later, he quietly turned the final page, closed the binder, and looked back toward the 6 silent machines standing in perfect alignment beneath the afternoon sunlight. A small smile crossed his face, not because he believed the engines were broken, but because every report seemed to be describing the exact same mistake. Without another word, he purchased all 6 engines for little more than their scrap value, loaded them carefully onto a flatbed trailer, and drove away as the employees shook their heads in disbelief. None of them realized they had just watched $3 million disappear down the highway, because while everyone else had been searching for broken machines, Ethan Brooks had begun listening for the truth hidden inside them. The 6 enormous engines arrived at Ethan Brooks's modest repair garage just before sunset, their worn metal surfaces glowing beneath the fading orange light as the flatbed driver carefully unloaded them one by one. Curious neighbors slowed their cars to watch the unusual delivery, wondering why an ordinary mechanic would spend hard-earned money on machines that one of the largest aerospace companies in the country had already declared worthless. Ethan thanked the driver, closed the garage doors, and stood quietly in front of the engines for several minutes without touching a single wrench. His 10-year-old daughter, Emma, stepped inside carrying 2 sandwiches wrapped in paper. She looked from her father to the towering machines with wide eyes. "Are these the engines you told me about?" she asked softly. Ethan smiled. "Yes." She walked closer, studying the scratches, faded warning labels, and inspection markings left behind by countless engineers. "Can you fix them?" she asked. Ethan looked at the nearest engine before answering. "I do not know yet." Emma tilted her head. "Then why did you buy them?" He placed one hand gently against the cool metal housing. "Because everyone tried to make them speak before anyone truly listened." Emma did not completely understand, but she had learned long ago that her father never rushed toward answers. Every evening after finishing customer repairs, Ethan returned to the 6 engines carrying nothing more than a flashlight, a notebook, and a small mechanic stethoscope normally used to isolate unusual sounds inside diesel equipment. He did not remove a single bolt. He did not disconnect any wiring. Instead, he slowly examined every surface, compared manufacturing marks, traced fluid pathways with his fingertips, and read every page of the testing reports again beneath the warm light hanging above his workbench. Across the room, Emma quietly completed her homework while occasionally watching her father fill another page with careful observations. On the 3rd evening, Frank Miller, the owner of the neighboring repair shop, stopped by carrying 2 cups of fresh coffee. He stared at the engines and laughed with friendly disbelief. "You really think every engineer at Sterling Dynamics missed something?" Ethan accepted the coffee with a grateful smile. "I think intelligent people sometimes repeat the same assumption until it begins to sound like fact." Frank shook his head. "Hundreds of engineers cannot all be wrong." Ethan calmly opened one of the binders and pointed towards several pages filled with identical performance summaries. "They can if they all begin with the same question." Frank looked confused. "What does that mean?" Ethan closed the binder. "If the first assumption is wrong, every conclusion built on top of it will also be wrong." The garage became quiet again, except for the distant sound of passing traffic and the soft ticking of cooling metal after another warm summer day. Long after Emma had gone to bed, Ethan continued moving slowly from one engine to the next, listening through the mechanic's stethoscope, comparing tiny differences that no report had ever mentioned. Midnight passed, then another hour. Finally, just before turning off the lights, Ethan opened his notebook and wrote a single sentence across the top of a fresh page. He stared at those words for several seconds before gently closing the cover. The sentence did not say that the engines were damaged. It did not say they needed expensive repairs. Instead, it captured the quiet realization beginning to take shape inside his mind. Every report described exactly the same failure, but every engine was telling an entirely different story. For the next several mornings, Ethan Brooks followed exactly the same routine. He opened the garage before sunrise, completed repairs for regular customers throughout the day, shared dinner with Emma in their small kitchen, and returned to the 6 prototype engines after the last customer had gone home. Night after night, he resisted the temptation to take the engines apart because experience had taught him that the quickest repair was often the slowest path to the truth. Instead, he built a long work table beside the engines and covered it with every document that had arrived from Sterling Dynamics. Test reports, performance graphs, calibration records, maintenance logs, software summaries, sensor data, and engineering notes stretched across the entire surface and carefully organized. "Rose," Emma watched from the corner of the garage while coloring a picture for school. "You have been reading those papers longer than you have been looking at the engines," she said with a smile. Ethan looked up from another page filled with handwritten measurements. "Machines leave clues," he answered. "People leave clues, too." She thought about that for a moment before returning to her drawing. Late that afternoon, Frank Miller stopped by again carrying another cup of coffee. He noticed that none of the engines had been disassembled. "I still do not understand," he admitted. "Most mechanics would already have every panel removed." Ethan folded another report and placed it beside the others. "If I open the engines now, I might accidentally erase the evidence I'm trying to understand. Frank crossed his arms. So what have you learned after all these days? Ethan pointed towards 6 nearly identical performance charts. Look carefully. Frank leaned over the table. Every graph showed the same sudden performance collapse at nearly the same point during testing. Every written conclusion blamed internal failure. Every recommendation called the engines beyond recovery. Frank frowned. They all failed exactly the same way. Ethan slowly nodded. That is the problem. Frank looked confused. Why would that be a problem? Ethan smiled gently. Because machines built separately almost never develop identical failures at exactly the same moment. But testing procedures can. The words lingered in the quiet garage as Frank stared back at the reports with growing uncertainty. Ethan reached for a ruler and carefully aligned 6 pages side by side. Tiny handwritten notes circled identical sensor readings recorded seconds before each engine had supposedly failed. Then he compared those numbers with the physical condition of the engines themselves. The evidence refused to agree. Components described as severely damaged showed almost no signs of abnormal wear. Airflow passages remained remarkably clean. Precision surfaces displayed uniform patterns that suggested stability rather than catastrophic failure. Every new observation pushed Ethan farther from the official explanation and closer to an entirely different conclusion. As midnight approached, he opened the original testing manual one more time and quietly read every instruction from beginning to end. One small section describing airflow calibration caught his attention. He read it again, then a third time. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. He stood, walked slowly toward the nearest engine, and examined the intake assembly under a bright inspection light before comparing it with the calibration diagram in the manual. Emma, who had fallen asleep on the office couch, stirred as she heard her father whisper only 4 quiet words to himself. They tested the process. He immediately corrected himself with a calm smile. No, they tested the wrong process. For the first time since the 6 forgotten engines arrived at his garage, Ethan no longer wondered whether they could be restored. He had begun to understand that the engines had never been trying to prove they were broken. They had been patiently revealing that every report had started with the same mistaken assumption. The following morning, Ethan Brooks unlocked the garage before dawn, determined not to prove himself right, but to prove the evidence honest. He knew that extraordinary conclusions demanded ordinary discipline, so he refused to rely on instinct alone. Every measurement would have to be repeated. Every assumption would have to earn its place. While the rest of the neighborhood slowly came to life, he carefully assembled a temporary testing station using equipment collected over years of repairing industrial machinery. Some instruments were old but precisely maintained. Others had been modified by Ethan himself to produce cleaner readings than the factory settings allowed. Emma stepped into the garage carrying a small paper bag filled with homemade breakfast sandwiches. She smiled as she noticed dozens of fresh notes covering the workbench. Did you figure it out? She asked hopefully. Ethan returned her smile, but gently shook his head. I found a question that everyone stopped asking. She placed the food beside him. Is that good? Ethan looked toward the 6 silent engines. Sometimes the right question is worth more than the fastest answer. After Emma left for school, Ethan began rebuilding the original testing sequence exactly as it had been described in Sterling Dynamics documentation. Every cable, every sensor location, every calibration value matched the records. As expected, the first engine produced the same alarming performance drop documented months earlier by the corporate engineering team. Ethan quietly wrote down every reading without changing anything. Then he returned to the beginning. This time he adjusted only one variable. It was not inside the engine. It was inside the airflow measurement procedure itself. The change took less than 2 minutes. He repeated the entire test from the beginning. The numbers immediately began telling a completely different story. Pressure remained stable. Temperature stayed well within safe operating limits. Vibration decreased instead of increasing. Most surprising of all, the power output continued climbing smoothly beyond the exact point where every official report claimed catastrophic failure had already occurred. Ethan did not celebrate. Instead, he performed the entire procedure again, and then again. Every result matched the previous one with remarkable consistency. Late that afternoon, Frank Miller returned and noticed the growing stack of fresh data sheets. "Please tell me you finally opened one of those engines," he joked. Ethan quietly handed him 2 graphs. "Compare these." Frank studied the pages. The first graph matched the original Sterling Dynamics report. The second displayed smooth, stable performance through the entire operating range. "These cannot both belong to the same engine," Frank said. Ethan calmly replied, "They do." Frank stared at him in disbelief. "What changed?" Ethan pointed toward a single line inside the testing checklist. "Only this." Frank read the instruction twice before looking back at Ethan. "You were saying the engine was never failing?" Ethan nodded slowly. The testing procedure forced the sensors to interpret normal airflow as instability. Every engineer trusted the numbers because every machine repeated the same mistake. Frank let out a slow breath as the realization settled over him. Then the reports were not measuring a broken engine. Ethan gently closed the binder. They were measuring a flawed method. As evening sunlight filtered through the garage windows, Ethan walked past all 6 engines with a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with pride. He understood that restoring the machines would not be the greatest challenge ahead. Convincing the world that 6 carefully documented failures had never truly failed at all would require something even more difficult than engineering. It would require people to admit that certainty, when built upon the wrong assumption, could become the most expensive mistake of all. By the end of the week, Ethan Brooks had repeated the revised testing procedure dozens of times, changing only one variable at a time until every result pointed toward the same undeniable conclusion. The engines had never needed extraordinary repairs because they had never suffered the catastrophic failures described in the official reports. They had simply been judged through a process that misunderstood what they were designed to do. Still, Ethan knew that numbers written inside a notebook would never change anyone's mind. The engines would have to speak for themselves. Early Saturday morning, while Emma swept the garage floor and organized tools into neat rows, Ethan prepared the first prototype for a complete demonstration under the corrected testing conditions. He carefully inspected every connection one last time before stepping back. Emma looked at him with quiet excitement. "Are you nervous?" she asked. Ethan smiled gently. "A little. Not because I'm afraid of being wrong. Because I want to be fair to the truth." Frank Miller arrived just as the final sensor was secure in place. He leaned against the garage doorway with folded arms. "If this works," he said with a grin, "I'm going to spend the rest of my life wondering how an entire corporation missed it." Ethan looked toward the control panel. "If it works, I hope they learn something instead of feeling embarrassed." Frank laughed softly. "You are kinder than most people would be." Ethan answered without looking away from the engine. "Kindness gives people room to admit mistakes." The garage fell completely silent. Ethan slowly initiated the startup sequence. Power flowed through the system exactly as planned. The engine responded with a smooth mechanical rhythm that echoed through the building, steady and controlled. Every instrument began reporting healthy values. Pressure remained balanced. Airflow increased exactly as Ethan had predicted. Temperature stabilized within the expected operating range. The vibration that had once been labeled dangerous never appeared. Instead, the machine continued operating with remarkable consistency as the output climbed higher and higher beyond the point where every official report had declared complete failure. Frank stared at the monitoring screen in disbelief. "It just passed the shutdown point," he whispered. Ethan nodded, but continued watching every measurement. Another minute passed, then another. The engine never hesitated. Emma looked from the glowing display to her father with a smile that grew wider every second. "It sounds happy," she said. Ethan chuckled quietly. "It sounds understood." Frank immediately pulled out his phone. People are never going to believe this unless they see it. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. Frank recorded a short video showing the stable performance readings, the operating engine, and Ethan calmly explaining the single correction made to the testing procedure without criticizing anyone involved. Before uploading the clip, Frank looked at Ethan. "Do you want me to mention Sterling Dynamics?" Ethan gently shook his head. "No, let the facts speak first. Names can wait." Within hours, the video began spreading through engineering forums, repair communities, and professional discussion groups across the country. Experienced mechanics replayed the footage repeatedly, examining every gauge and every measurement. Retired aerospace engineers left thoughtful comments questioning the original testing method. Independent specialists requested copies of Ethan's data for review. By sunset, thousands of people had watched a machine that the industry had already declared impossible to restore, and for the first time since. Those 6 forgotten engines had left Sterling Dynamics. The conversation was no longer about whether they had failed. It had quietly become a question of whether the experts had been measuring the wrong thing all along. The video reached Sterling Dynamics on Monday morning before most executives had finished their first cup of coffee. Engineers gathered around conference room screens, replaying the demonstration again and again in complete silence. The comments beneath the video were no longer coming only from mechanics. University researchers, retired aerospace specialists, and independent testing laboratories had begun analyzing every frame. None of them claimed the demonstration proved everything, but many agreed on one uncomfortable possibility. The testing procedure deserved another look. Victoria, Sterling watched the recording without interrupting anyone. She paid close attention to the calm voice explaining each measurement, noticing that the mechanic never mocked the company, never accused the engineers of incompetence, and never attempted to embarrass anyone. He simply presented evidence with remarkable patience. When the video ended, the room remained unusually quiet. Finally, Victoria looked toward her senior engineering team. "Did anyone verify his data?" she asked. The chief engineer shifted uncomfortably. "Not yet." "Then why are we discussing opinions instead of measurements?" she replied. Within hours, an internal review team attempted to recreate the demonstration using archived records. The numbers refused to match the original reports as neatly as they once had. Small inconsistencies began appearing in calibration logs that no one had questioned before because every department had trusted the previous department's conclusions. Victoria closed the file and made a decision. "I want to meet him." The following afternoon, a black executive sedan quietly pulled into the parking lot outside Ethan Brooks's modest repair garage. There were no cameras, no reporters, and no announcement. Victoria stepped out wearing a simple navy business suit instead of the formal attire she usually wore for corporate events. She looked around the small building, noticing neatly organized tools, clean workbenches, and the quiet rhythm of honest work. Ethan was finishing a repair on a customer's pickup truck when he noticed the unfamiliar visitor. He wiped his hands with a clean shop towel and walked over with the same calm expression he greeted every customer. "Good afternoon," he said politely. "How can I help you?" Victoria introduced herself without mentioning her position, but Ethan recognized her immediately. His expression did not change. He simply smiled and invited her inside. As they walked deeper into the garage, Victoria stopped in front of the first prototype engine. It was running smoothly on the test stand, its instruments displaying stable readings that contradicted everything she had believed only weeks earlier. She slowly walked to the second engine, then the third. Each one showed the same quiet consistency. She looked back at Ethan. "How many are working?" she asked softly. Ethan answered with complete honesty. 5 have completed the full revised procedure. The 6th is almost ready. Victoria remained silent for several moments, studying the machines that her company had officially abandoned. "Are you planning to sell them?" she finally asked. Ethan glanced toward the engines before answering. "Not until I know every result can be repeated by someone else. Truth should never depend on one person's reputation." Victoria looked at him with growing respect. She had expected confidence, perhaps even pride. Instead, she found humility anchored by discipline. As she prepared to leave, her eyes rested one final time on the quiet row of engines. She realized she was no longer looking at discarded equipment. She was looking at 6 questions her company had never truly answered, and standing beside them was a man who seemed far more interested in understanding than in proving anyone wrong. News traveled faster than Ethan Brooks had expected, but not in the way most viral stories did. There were no dramatic headlines claiming miracles or impossible discoveries. Instead, respected engineering organizations quietly requested permission to observe his revised testing procedure. Independent laboratories contacted him with professional courtesy, asking whether they could verify his results using their own equipment. Ethan accepted every request with one simple condition. They had to follow the documented process exactly and publish every result, whether it supported his conclusions or not. Over the next 2 weeks, one laboratory after another completed their evaluations. Each report reached the same conclusion. The 6 prototype engines met or exceeded their original design expectations when tested under the corrected procedure. What had once been labeled as unstable performance was revealed to be a misunderstanding created by an inaccurate calibration sequence. The findings spread quickly through the aerospace industry. Manufacturers that had previously ignored the surplus auction suddenly contacted Ethan with serious business proposals. One company offered $500,000 for a single engine. Another requested licensing discussions for the revised testing methodology. A research organization proposed purchasing 2 engines for advanced development. By the end of the month, the combined written offers had quietly surpassed $3 million. Frank Miller stared at the growing stack of certified letters on Ethan's workbench and slowly shook his head. "A few weeks ago, people thought you wasted your savings on scrap metal," he said. "Now they're competing to buy the same machines." Ethan carefully placed another unopened envelope beside the others. "The engines did not become valuable," he replied. "People finally understood what they were seeing." Emma looked up from a small desk where she was finishing her homework. "Does that mean we are rich now?" she asked with innocent curiosity. Ethan smiled warmly before sitting beside her. "It means we have more choices than we had yesterday. That is different from being rich." Emma nodded thoughtfully. She had learned that her father measured success differently from most people. Later that afternoon, Victoria Sterling received copies of the independent laboratory reports. She read every page herself without asking for an executive summary. The conclusions were unmistakable. The engines that her company had, sold for little more than scrap value, had now been validated by organizations with no financial interest in the outcome. More difficult to accept was another detail repeated throughout every report. The revised testing procedure had proven remarkably simple. It required no expensive redesign, no replacement components, and no revolutionary technology. It demanded only a willingness to question an assumption that everyone else had accepted without hesitation. Victoria quietly placed the final report on her desk and looked through the large window overlooking the engineering campus she had spent years building. She did not feel anger toward Ethan. She felt something far heavier: responsibility. Somewhere inside her own company, intelligent people had stopped asking careful questions because they believed the answers were already known. As evening settled over the city, Ethan closed his garage for the day and turned off the lights one by one. The 6 engines stood quietly beneath the soft overhead lamps, no longer forgotten machines waiting for someone to notice them. They had become a reminder that truth often arrives without raising its voice, and that real value is not created by public opinion, but revealed when someone has the patience to look beyond it. Several days after the final independent verification was published, Victoria Sterling ordered the company's historical engineering archives to be reopened. The request surprised everyone. Those files had not been reviewed in years because the original development program had long since been considered complete. Yet the more Victoria studied the laboratory reports, the more one question refused to leave her mind. How had a neighborhood mechanic understood a technology that hundreds of specialists had failed to recognize? She instructed the records department to retrieve every design revision, every engineering memorandum, every technical drawing, and every personnel file connected to the prototype program from its earliest days. Boxes of carefully preserved documents soon covered the long conference table inside a secure archive room. Hour after hour, Victoria quietly turned page after page, following the evolution of the project from its first sketches to its final production plans. Most names appeared only briefly before disappearing as employees transferred, retired, or accepted positions elsewhere. Then she reached a series of handwritten engineering notes attached to the earliest airflow design reviews. The handwriting was remarkably precise. The calculations filled entire margins with elegant solutions that simplified problems other engineers had considered unavoidable. At the bottom of every page appeared the same signature: Ethan Brooks. Victoria stopped turning pages. She opened another folder. The same name appeared again beside the original airflow architecture proposal. Another document credited Ethan with developing the diagnostic philosophy that encouraged engineers to question measurements before questioning hardware. Additional files revealed internal recommendations, praising his unusual ability to solve problems by observing systems instead of rushing into repairs. Victoria continued reading until she found the final personnel record. Ethan had quietly resigned years earlier after choosing to leave the aerospace industry following the death of his wife, so he could raise his young daughter without constant travel and endless overtime. There had been no public announcement, no farewell ceremony, and no attempt to preserve his institutional knowledge. The company had simply continued moving forward, assuming someone else would naturally replace what had been lost. Victoria slowly closed the file and leaned back in complete silence. The realization settled over her with unexpected weight. Ethan had not uncovered someone else's mistake by chance. He had recognized the original intent behind the design, because he had helped create the philosophy that shaped it from the beginning. Later that afternoon, Victoria drove alone to Ethan's garage carrying a single weathered folder carefully protected inside a leather portfolio. Ethan was finishing routine maintenance on a family sedan when she arrived. He greeted her with the same quiet courtesy as before. Without speaking, Victoria placed the old engineering folder on his workbench. Ethan looked down at the faded cover and gently ran his fingers across the familiar project number. For a brief moment, memories passed silently through his expression before he opened the folder. Inside were copies of his earliest handwritten design notes, preserved exactly as he had left them years before. Victoria watched him carefully. "I finally understand why the engine sounded different to you," she said softly. Ethan smiled with quiet gratitude rather than pride. "Every engineer remembers the questions they asked while creating something," he replied. "Sometimes those questions matter longer than the answers." Victoria lowered her eyes for a moment, realizing that the greatest discovery had never been hidden inside 6 forgotten engines. It had been hidden inside the quiet life of a man whose wisdom had gone unnoticed simply because he never demanded to be seen. The following week, Sterling Dynamics invited employees, research partners, and industry leaders to a company gathering unlike any it had hosted before. There were no product launches, no marketing presentations, and no celebration of quarterly profits. At the center of the stage stood a simple podium beside 6 prototype engines that had once been dismissed as failures. Victoria Sterling stepped forward and looked across the room before speaking. "Today is not about correcting a machine," she said calmly. "It is about correcting our way of thinking." The audience listened in complete silence as she described how independent laboratories had confirmed the revised testing procedure and how a single overlooked assumption had shaped years of mistaken conclusions. Then she paused before saying the words that surprised everyone most. "Our greatest mistake was believing that experience alone guaranteed we were asking the right questions." She turned toward the front row, where Ethan Brooks sat beside Emma, both dressed simply as they always were. "Mr. Brooks, would you please join me?" Ethan walked to the stage without hurry, carrying himself with the same quiet dignity that had defined every step of his journey. Victoria handed him the original engineering folder along with a framed document recognizing his foundational contributions to the company's earliest propulsion research. She then addressed the audience once more. "Years ago, we allowed an extraordinary engineer to leave without understanding what we were losing. More recently, we sold away technology we believed had no future because we trusted conclusions more than curiosity. Today, we choose a different path. She presented Ethan with an offer to return as Senior Director of Engineering Innovation, giving him complete authority to establish a new review program focused on critical thinking, open collaboration, and independent verification. The room erupted into warm applause, but Ethan waited until the sound gently faded before speaking. "I am deeply grateful," he began, "but I will accept only if every engineer, from the newest graduate to the most experienced executive, is encouraged to question assumptions without fear of embarrassment. Progress begins when people feel safe enough to ask whether something everyone believes might still deserve another look." Victoria smiled and extended her hand. Agreed. They shook hands not as opponents, but as two professionals united by respect for truth. In the months that followed, Sterling Dynamics transformed its engineering culture. Review meetings welcomed fresh perspectives instead of rewarding quick agreement. Testing procedures required independent validation before major decisions were finalized. Young engineers discovered that thoughtful questions carried as much value as confident answers. Ethan divided his time between the company and his neighborhood garage, refusing to abandon the simple life that had taught Emma the importance of humility, patience, and honest work. The 6 prototype engines were placed on permanent display inside the company's innovation center, not as symbols of technical achievement, but as reminders that wisdom often arrives quietly. Visitors regularly stopped to read the small plaque beneath them. It did not mention the millions of dollars the engines eventually became worth. It did not celebrate business success or engineering brilliance. It simply read, "These engines were never saved by someone who believed he knew everything. They were understood by someone who never stopped listening." Every time Ethan walked past that display with Emma beside him, he smiled softly, knowing that the greatest reward had never been wealth, recognition, or a prestigious title. It was the quiet satisfaction of seeing truth restored, respect returned, and an entire generation of engineers reminded that genuine greatness begins with the humility to listen before deciding what is impossible.